Good. It's a pleasure to have with us today Judge Glock from the Cicero Institute and talking to us about his work on homelessness policies, in particular in Austin. So Judge, thanks for joining us, first of all. And let's start talking a little bit about the Cicero Institute. So what is the Cicero Institute?
Cicero Institute is a relatively new institute, a think tank in a way. I was founded just about 2 years ago in San Francisco, but we've joined the great California exodus and have relocated to Austin with most of our technological peers and funders and so forth. So Cicero Institute does what a lot of other think tanks do. We publish pieces, we write op-eds, we do research into public policy issues, but one of the things that we try to do at Cicero, which is distinctive, is do the whole alpha to omega changing of the laws, which means when we have a good idea that we want to help actually put in practice, we go into the statutes in a certain state. Right now, we're working in 8 states, and we have lobbyists in 8 states to help us out, thankfully. And we go in there, we write what the new law should look like. We write brief op-eds to help convince people of the value of the law. We write little short pieces of one-pagers that we can wave in state legislators' faces to show you, this is what the law does, and this is how it benefits you, and so forth. And then we run the law across the gamut and get it signed by the governor. And this year, as I said, we're operating 8 states. I think we're optimistically going to have something 12 to 15 different laws passed. And again, that's not just like, well, we testified and we like a law that's passed, but we're actually wrote it and got it across the finish line. So that's what's a little distinctive about us. It's a fun project. It takes away a little more time from the abstract research, but you get to have a more impact on people in the field. And that's one of the reasons I joined the group and left academia for it. I've been having a lot of fun doing it. So that's the.
It's a rather pessimistic name, isn't it? But
Cicero Institute?
Yeah, I mean, given how that turned out, but sorry.
Yeah, we wrote a little piece about why Joe Lonsdale, who was the original founder and funder, called it the Cicero Institute. He stood up for what he believed, and he did make
wait, you must slow it down the process.
He was good as the governor of Sicily.
Well, I hope it ends better for you.
Exactly, and he prosecuted. Well, he did pretty good. He became an international celebrity for the next 2,000 years. He did good as governor of Sicily, and he prosecuted the Catalan conspiracy. So, not all is well that ends well. He did a lot of good in the.
All right, so let's turn to the issue of the day then, and so what was how did you guys get involved with the project on homelessness? Was something motivated by an issue that's going on across the country, or was anything specific to the issues in Texas and in particular Austin leading up to what we have here and a ballot in front of us in a couple of weeks?
Yeah. So, I mean, it is obviously a major issue in many urban areas across the U.S. I mean, the main reason we got involved in it is because it was a big issue in San Francisco when we were there, obviously, and it's just an equally large issue since we've moved over here to Austin. One of the things that may surprise people here in Texas, in Austin proper may not be as surprising, but in California before the coronavirus, a poll of the voters said that was the #1 issue facing the state, which is kind of incredible when you think about it. A very small percentage of the population, even in California, is homeless. But they were telling people this issue struck to their hearts and their concerns more than any others. And if you've ever toured San Francisco's Tenderloin or Skid Row on LA, you'd see why. And obviously recently with Prop B happening here in Austin, which is attempting to restore the camping ban, we see how heated these discussions become. So we just saw the issue as something that was very important. I myself have worked previously in housing policy mainly, and so inevitably the movement into homelessness policy is something that was very near and dear to me. And the other side of that is we thought the contemporary policies that have almost dominated the field just aren't working. We can get into that more a little later, but there's a kind of universal model called the housing first model that people thought about 10, 15 years ago was going to quote unquote end homelessness, and it certainly hasn't. And so we thought it was time for cities and states to start taking a different direction.
So just to also focus on some data here on the problem. So has the problem grown nationally over the past 15 years, or is something that has been more concentrated in certain localities in the country? Do we have a measure of the overall? Because, you know, when you think about right before the pandemic, we are perhaps in one of the most prosperous times in our history. Right, January 2020 is one of the wealthiest point of our history, right? And so is it the case that that particular segment of the population vulnerable to homelessness was growing steadily over time, or was something that we now have that be more present in urban locales like San Francisco, LA, then Austin, and so on?
Yeah, so one of the things that you learn if you research homelessness is that the numbers on this are just atrocious. Frankly, we didn't have any national numbers before about 2007. Since then, the federal government has required what they call a point-in-time count, which is that most cities and states across the country are required, usually in January, when more people are in shelter, to go around and just sort of count heads, how many people are in the beds. And then you go outside and people comb the streets and see, well, how many people are sleeping in cars and how many people are, in tents and outside. And that's when we get these numbers from. Now, overall, we've seen reductions in homelessness. Have you mentioned these prosperous times? We've seen 650,000 homeless people in America in about 2009, and that was down to about 550,000 in 2020 before the coronavirus hit. So these overall reductions are important. But the thing those numbers don't tell is we've seen a sudden increase, especially in the last 7 or 8 years, in unsheltered homelessness. So the kind of homelessness that you and I think about when we think of homeless, which is this person sleeping on the street, has increased about 20%. And it's now about a third of all homeless people. And by some measures, that overall reduction in homelessness really just means a lot more people have been put into these what are called permanent supportive housing units, which some people can say kind of are like an indefinite shelter. So if you include those, there's been a drastic increase in overall homelessness, but just in a different kind of a movement from one sort of homeless shelter to another. So in some ways, it always depends on how you cut the numbers. We've seen reductions in overall, but I think most people would agree in the area we care most about, the people on the streets, the most desperate, we've seen increases in that. And that's what's driving a lot of this concern in local areas.
So, all right. So I think I see a picture in one of your pieces that on Medium, we can link in over here after the discussion, where you also focus on the change in shelter versus unshelter after certain particular interventions take place, right? In particular, the Austin intervention of 2019. So tell us a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the things we talk about is camping bans and the effect on homelessness. And obviously, again, there's an election here in Austin that is going to happen on May 1st, but early voting has already started on Proposition B to restore this camping ban that was in place. And one of the things we've seen is that the relaxation of camping bans lead to sudden increases in unsheltered homelessness. So right after Austin passed its new laws in June 2019, you saw an almost 50% increase in people on the streets in Austin. Now, some people said, well, that's just because they're more visible, they don't have to hide, and I'm sure there's some of that. But what you also saw was a 20% decrease in sheltered homelessness. People were leaving the shelter for the streets, and that's not uncommon. We've seen other areas like San Francisco, like LA, where when they've relaxed these bans, you've seen people return to the streets. And we can debate about what the cost and benefits of that are. Maybe some people definitely say, well, you don't want to criminalize it. But the other side, and you'll get this a lot more if you talk to people in the substance abuse treatment realm or mental health providers, is that these people on the street are distinct from a lot of the homeless population. So you will hear numbers, people will be correctly saying, listen, only about 20% of homeless people have an addiction issue, or only about 20% have a mental health issue. And this is true. But if you look at the people on the street themselves, that is an entirely different population. The people going in and out of shelters, often for very short term, have economic problems. They need help. They need to step up. They don't have these sort of pervasive long-term issues. But the people that are on the street tend to be overwhelmingly, and the numbers are sort of 75% report having a severe addiction problem, and 75% report having a severe mental health problem. And the majority have both. So these are people with numerous barriers. And one of the concerns is that people who are in these conditions are usually not in the right mind to seek treatment. And there's some concern that allowing the people to get out of these shelters is exacerbating the problem with lack of access to treatment. And we've also seen that. One of the numbers I cite shows that in LA, after they reduced into the camping ban there in Skid Row, you saw overdose deaths go up by 50%, excuse me, actually doubled, more than doubled in about 6 or 7 years. And so these bans, again, I understand the controversy around them, and I understand the harm it does to some people who may be caught up in it. But the fact is, on the whole, they seem to get more people into treatment and they get more people back into shelters, while relaxing them seems to get people out of shelters. So that's sort of the balance that people have to weigh there.
So can I jump in here? So on the Austin camping ban, I think there are two things that we've hit on so far. One is the increase in visibility after the ban, and the other is this movement from shelters to the street. And my understanding is that Austin was kind of late to this game, and they did like fact-finding missions in on the West Coast to see how to go about dealing with the homelessness. So would this have been something that would have been apparent to them at the time, to the extent that this is kind of an intentional effort to move people from shelters onto the street? Because some of the rhetoric around the camping ban relaxation was basically like exactly so. We want this to be more visible so that you'll know you need to deal with this. So do you have a sense, should they have known this was going to happen?
Yes, basically, if you look at, and it is always surprising when people cite like, well, we took fact-finding trips to LA and San Francisco, and the general assumption is that these places are almost unmitigated disasters in terms of their homeless policy. Almost everyone agrees that whatever they're doing about homelessness, it's clearly not working. But yeah, you had some people in, exactly. You had some people in the advocacy community said, listen, it's a problem, and until you get it in people's faces, they won't recognize it, and they won't sort of give up the money to create the extra housing that we need to shelter these people. That was some of the, kind of undisputed language going into it. The problem in that is what you've seen is one, I talked before about the housing first model, and the sad fact is there's never going to be enough money to give a free house to every single person who wants one. And we've seen that in places, frankly, like San Francisco. San Francisco built these permanent supportive housing units, these units where you give someone on the street an indefinite housing unit for as long as they want to live there. And hopefully that will, quote unquote, end homelessness. They built enough to shelter every single person that was homeless, chronically homeless in San Francisco 15 years ago. The homelessness doubled nonetheless. Similar sort of things in LA. So that sort of story that, well, if you make it more visible, people are going to fund the right housing, and that's going to help people get into the housing units, didn't seem to play out. But the other side of that is exactly the problem I mentioned earlier, that where you saw the relaxation of these camping bans, you saw sudden surges in violence and overdose deaths. So LA, I mentioned there was a study done in 2006. They had what they called the Safer Cities Initiative. They began cleaning up Skid Row, and they saw a reduction in homelessness about half, a reduction in unsheltered homelessness most of all, and a reduction of violence and overdose deaths by about half. As I said before, when they ended that, they saw a sudden doubling of overdose deaths, and they saw a 50% increase in violence, mainly among with homeless, both perpetrators and victims. So the story that you got from some relaxation of the camping ban, that this would make it more visible, this would allow people to get treatment, this would allow the service providers to have more access to them if they weren't hiding, that didn't seem to play out. And it hasn't played out in other areas. I've mentioned in my piece places like Colorado Springs, where Colorado Springs instituted a ban in 2010. And immediately they got 2/3 people of the unsheltered homeless either to return to their families to employment or to return to shelters. So that seems to be the general result of a lot of these bans, and these really help people get into the treatment. While the alternative, because again, most of these people are unfortunately suffering from severe mental illness or addiction problems, is without that extra push, they're not going to get into treatment. And that seems to be the general case.
So that suggests that the actual outcomes that we look at in Austin, that we think of as possibly unintended negative outcomes. It almost seems like we knew that was going to happen, and therefore that must be their objective. Which seems like an interesting objective for a city council to have.
Yeah, one would almost think, I don't want to say it's something like the old Marxist line that the worse the better, therefore you raw the wounds of oppression. But there was some rhetoric like that around the end of the ban. And, I mentioned the incredible death rates in LA, which, as I often mention, were higher death rates for unsheltered homeless than our soldiers serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. Just, 1 out of every 200 homeless people dying every single year on the streets. And we're getting closer to that in Austin. We had 250 homeless deaths last year and 190 deaths on the street in 2019, the first year they repealed the camping ban. When they last did a survey of homeless deaths about 7 or 8 years ago, it was about 70, less than 70. And so we've seen tripling of homeless deaths, most especially around the repeal of the camping ban. So that seems to have had an incredibly negative consequence in terms of the life. And could this have been predicted? One would think. We've seen these results happen elsewhere. This is not sort of unheralded. One would think in this case, they went to LA. They've seen what happened when they allowed these things, the encampments to proliferate. And, so far the results have not been great.
It's interesting
So
from
let
a
me-
political
let me,
economy perspective that this is what we get.
Let me ask you a question on
Yeah,
that point.
it's
A question.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry. I was going to say just a question on that.
Oh, no,
point, though.
just
You
on the sort of.
You mentioned issues of deploying services to people. That the idea that some people would use as well by making them coming out somehow, right, would allow them to be serviced, to the social services to be more closely get to them and help in the ways that they can help. What strikes me as surprising about the measures in place is that, well, if that was the objective, why not have that done in Zilker Park? There'll be a much more humanitarian way to have people camp, to have people, in a more pleasant space than under the overpasses of their town, right? And also concentrated in an area. Is that something that other places have done successfully? I believe you mentioned some of that in San Antonio, perhaps, and some other places where you designated an area where it's a nice, well sort of serviced area where people can camp and the services can be actually get to them in a much more effective way. Is that something in the cards here moving forward?
Yeah, so it's actually when I discuss some of the laws we're trying to pass in other states and that we look like we're going to get passed in perhaps Georgia, Arizona, and we're trying to assist some lawmakers here in Texas, is exactly that you can always have an alternative to street camping. And one of those alternatives, not ideal, but clearly superior to the one where they're right now scattered under highway overpasses and parks and all the rest of it, is to designate some area where people can camp. They can bring their camping equipment in and they can get access to services, and the service providers can provide that to them. So yeah, there are a few areas that have tried this. Phoenix has tried a small version outside of their main homeless shelter, and I recently toured it. You can see the areas with this, what's called structured camping facility. Not ideal, but relatively clean, relatively well maintained, with people who have access to water and sanitation. And you can see directly outside the fence, you can see chaos, garbage, and human waste because they don't have bathrooms and the rest of it. Austin has done a small bit about this. The state government has created what's now known as the Esperanza community on the under I-35 or near I-35 on the east side of Austin. And again, people have critiqued this as well. It's not a individual home for everyone who lives there. It's not the great, but you compare those camps and you compare, frankly, the mortality rates and the survival rates of people in these camps, and they're clearly superior to the people who are camping just without supervision on the streets and on the sidewalks and on the rest of it. So as I often remind people, there's always an alternative to street camping. Those who say we can't do anything, like you mentioned, there are many places. Again, even early Austin, Georgia has tried small one in these camping facilities, which look, if we want them to get access to treatment, here we can provide this centralized and we can have access to these people and know where they are and help them get what they need. The problem with that is then people claim that, one, it's not doing enough, and that two, local governments have to take hard decisions. They have to say, well, here, I want this camping structure in point A and not point B, and someone might be mad at that. But right now, you're allowing people to take over a public place, but you're just kind of delegating that decision to any individual who wants to camp. And clearly yeah, exactly.
So I would jump in on there. Like there was some details on where you could and could not camp in the original ordinance. And the most striking thing to me was like, you can camp pretty much any public property except parks, and particularly except City Hall. So they were conscious of preventing camping at City Hall. I would think, like, could the state like reverse that and just say no camping on public property except City Hall and provide the services there? That would seem like
they could. Yeah, and there's certainly debates about exactly that, where they can do
I mean, they were
very and so forth.
To the extent that they were aware of the outcomes that would happen as a result of the relaxation of the ban, having the people who are most responsible for those outcomes, face it would seem like a more equitable solution to the problem.
Yeah, but this is not uncommon. This San Francisco, even when they've relaxed bans, they used to have an encampment right outside on City Hall Park, and they removed that one. They weren't too happy about that encampment, even if they were more okay with encampments sort of outside of that area and elsewhere. So yeah, that's the pretty typical that's the pretty typical local response. They know it's a problem, and they know people aren't happy with it, so they restrict it in some areas, but often areas that have less political pull, they don't get the same sort of the clear.
We certainly don't have camping on.
This is what you see in San Francisco.
Yeah, like I never see anyone camping.
Well, exactly.
Even though this is probably the concentration where people most support, or are most against the repeal of the ban. Yet it's pretty clearly not happening here. So
yeah,
the political economy.
They wouldn't allow it.
Who lives near interstates? People who have no power at all. So.
Yeah, it does tend to be in poor areas and areas with less political pull. And, I'm almost reluctant to mention it, but directly behind my house, about 15 feet from my back fence, is a homeless encampment on a park that I live next. This happened after I moved here and long after I've been working on homeless policy. I know everyone in the camp right there. Kaylee, Linda, Richard, and Adam are good people. They are in a crisis. As I tell people, it is neither good for them nor for the city to have them in a camp right now with open fires, with no waste disposal and all the rest of it. I bear them no ill will at all, but these are the areas, the slightly poorer neighborhoods that get those sort of encampments. And as you mentioned, the City Hall and the rest of them don't abide by it.
The W Hotel doesn't have camping inside the lobby, I don't think, which is where our mayor lives, of course.
Major point, Richard. Judge, a question about the mobility of the. So I'm thinking about, just as an economist for a second, and thinking about the incentives people face and how they decide on those incentives. Is there any sense in which the places that make the availability of the camps or they're more lenient towards homeless population, is there any indication, any data that suggests that people then choose to move to those localities? I would think that the growth in Austin the past few years, can that be explained to some extent by a decrease in folks coming from San Antonio, Houston, and Dallas? Because, well, turns out that it's easier to hang out in Austin, might be easier to have access to what they're looking for, especially the ones that are preferring to be outside of homeless shelters. Do we have information on that, or that's not really clear?
Yeah, so this is obviously a big debate. You will hear many people saying people are moving here because of the relaxation of the camping ban, and others who say this is totally bogus, there's no evidence for it. But we do have some numbers on this. I often mention the point in time count, which I said before, all the cities are required to count. And Austin actually surveys people as part of that to say, where did you become homeless? Where did you become homeless and did you move here? And in Austin, 37%. So, not quite, but, more than 1 in 3 homeless people have come from outside the city while they were homeless. And as I often remind people too, that is of overall homeless numbers. As I said before, there's a very distinct population between the sheltered and the unsheltered population. They don't distinguish where those people are coming from, but unsheltered. But I think most people agree at this point, the majority of the unsheltered and the minority of the sheltered population is coming from outside the city. So there does seem to be, clearly we know that some people are leaving shelters for the streets, as I mentioned those numbers before, but we also know that people are coming from outside of the city. And, I talked to a Parks Department official about the park and the encampment behind here, and nobody will disagree that people come here from outside for a number of reasons, more social services, more lenient policies, and so forth. You know, homeless people. One of the individuals in my encampment, David, who I actually didn't mention before, said he moved here from outside of Austin because he liked the area and the restaurant. Again, very nice guy, but clearly in a mental crisis right now. And so, yeah, the numbers are pretty strong that there's a large percentage and maybe at least a majority of the unsheltered are coming from outside the city.
So to that end, is there any coordination across cities, for example, that, or at least an attempt to coordinate across cities to given that there's a problem that, you know, the short blanket situation, right? So you move policies over here, you might encourage people to move over there, and there's, you know, Austin might be helping out right now, but is this any kind of attempt of mayors of these different cities to work together and trying to solve this holistically as opposed to, you know, in individual points?
Not much, unfortunately. So it is kind of a lot of cities treat it as a devil take the hindmost sort of problem, where I hope it's your problem and not mine. Let's wish it away and all of the rest of it. One of the things you have seen is family reunification policies. Now, this gets derided often as what's called Greyhound therapy. You give someone a Greyhound bus ticket to go to X, Y, and Z. And this happens in all sorts of ways. Big cities do this to little cities do this to big cities. Now, on its own, there's some problems with it, but I often tell people, Community First Village directly outside of Austin, which is a beautiful campus to help people that are long-term homeless. You know, say homelessness is really more of a family and friendlessness problem than a homelessness problem per se. And even big cities like San Francisco have seen some success with these family reunification policies. You tell a homeless individual, listen, you want to get back to your brother or your uncle or your mother, we're going to pay to get you there. And ideally, you know, we follow up with you to do that. And, you know, we've seen some positive results from that. You know, this is not quite the same thing as every city working out its own, but this doesn't mean it's the wrong idea to help people get back with their families when, like you see in Austin, you see people coming from outside and losing those family connections.
So more broadly, I think you could interpret some of, you know, to an economist, it seems like taking away choices from people is usually a negative thing. But here, you know, you're in some of what you're writing, you're kind of making an argument that, well, we need to change the choice set, take away some choices, and give different choices. You know, do you have a sense that these overall, it seems like you have a sense that these people aren't necessarily making the best choices for themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer as an economist that people allowing more individual choice is a good thing. And in general, that is a good thing. Now, there's two issues on that, of course. One is the effect your choices impose on other people. And so there are issues that we live in a dense urban space. And of course, we cannot allow everybody to make their own choices willy-nilly of their effects on others. And so everyone agrees you can't just, you know, set up a camp in the middle of the tent or in the middle of the street or the sidewalk or something. So there's that side of it. But the other side of that is the one I mentioned before. When you look at the numbers, and then recently UCLA came out with a study on this, of the unsheltered population, and you see the overwhelming numbers of addiction and people with serious mental illness. I think everybody would agree with someone who is schizophrenic is not in a situation to make their own best choices. And if we have 75% of the unsheltered homeless that are severely mentally ill, according to their own lights and according to their own background, obviously you don't want someone in that situation to just make whatever decision they see best. That's why we have things like inpatient and outpatient commitment laws. And one of the things that we've been fighting for, especially, is to get more of this outpatient commitment. You will hear mental health providers pulling their hair out, especially in places like Phoenix, about the end of these camping bans and the proliferation of people on the street. It's because they can't get anybody into treatment. Before, they had a stick that said, listen, you have to go somewhere, you have to go in a shelter, you have to go in a place. And now they're just dried up, and the well that's leading people to get into that treatment is gone. And the same thing with drug courts. So a lot of cities like San Francisco, LA have these drug courts, which are set up for people with severe addiction problems who get caught up in the criminal justice system. And one of the things that you saw after the relaxation of the camping ban and the relaxation of petty theft laws and Prop 47 is you saw a lot more people, those drug courts dry up. So you had people that used to be going and sent into these court supervised programs that helped them get unaddicted, and now they don't have those anymore. So yeah, the combination of the externalities, as the economists call them, and the problem with people in addiction and mental health crisis means like, no, these often aren't in a situation where they need encouragement to get to that next step. And most of them after the fact will agree. You know, we've talked to many people that, you know, if you had given me a free house and no consequences 5 years ago, I would have killed myself, because I would have, and we've seen that actually in some of these housing programs, that people are sent into a house without supervision and they overdose very quickly. And it's a real tragedy.
But that does seem to be a big part of the rhetorical issue, is people see your plans as taking away choices. It always feels like they need, you know, you have to kind of create some sort of Rawlsian idea of like, what choices would these people make, you know, 5 years down the road once they, you know, yeah. But it's tricky because the language of coercion is always sort of,
yeah, it's always hard, but it is, you know, one of the things I remind people, this is a public space issue ultimately too. And we all agree, just like I can't swing my arms around wildly on a sidewalk and I couldn't set up a tent in the middle of the street, like where can people set up a tent? I couldn't set up a tent just in a park, obviously. And, you know, there's certain concerns about that. One of the things I mentioned, it seems like a small thing, and I admit it's certainly not the majority. But in Colorado Springs, about 20% of the people that were contacted by the police after the camping ban weren't homeless. They set up a tent. They had another home, and they set up a tent in the yard. The problem was that other people had to go through those streets and parks and the rest of it. So that issue, a lot of others, and yes, I mean, again, you can talk to people in the midst who've recovered from addiction and who've recovered from mental health crisis, and they will absolutely tell in that sort of Rawlsian original perspective, helping me further down the path of addiction or helping me further down the path of mental illness is not the path I wanted to take. I wanted to get out of that, and I didn't know it at the time. So many of these recovered people will say the exact same thing. And yeah, helping them get to that next step is crucial.
So you meant, so there's these two populations, right? And the ones that are economically fragile to some degree, that become homeless more like from that needs maybe some help getting out of that from a financial standpoint. And then there's the other two groups, mental healthness and drug addiction, that they're very different. So clearly they require very different solutions. The House First initiative is something that
Absolutely
might help the first group, but the first group is a minority of the total population. Right. So, and that seems to be the focus that we have right now, is like buying hotels, or San Francisco building houses and so on. So, talk about the solutions you're advocating here. I guess that's the next step, right? So yes, housing is an important step of this. Yes, making sure that, and by the way, the same people who is trying to solve this issue are the people that don't necessarily provide us with an enormous supply of housing, right? They stand in the way of supply of housing. So we need more housing. That's obvious, the point, and that will help the first group. And but tell us more about the proposals on the other side, on the other two groups.
Yeah. So one of the problems that have emerged in the past 7 or 8 years since the federal government emphasized the housing first model is we've cut back on short-term shelter. Because people have said we want to provide these permanent housing beds for someone who's chronically illness, we have less and less beds that are just there for someone who is on hard on their luck, who needs a spot for a short period and needs to move on to the next step of their lives. And one of the things we're trying to do is let's maximize the homeless dollars and allow more of these short-term shelter bed solutions. Some of that is through structured camps, such as the Esperanza community in Austin or Phoenix or in Georgia or these other places. Some of them are through these community cabins. Places like Oakland and others have found very cheap unit shelters where you can set up a small 1 or 2 person bed shelter for less than $30,000 and get more people back into those safe environments, often in hot places like Texas, into air conditioning as well. And so we're trying to emphasize dollars to that and sort of away from the permanent supportive housing model for the chronically ill homeless, which it doesn't seem to help on the whole. And the other part of that is to emphasize what we talk about as pay for performance funding, which is, there have been examples in other areas of social policy where instead of just say warehousing someone, we will keep you in a house for X number of days, you pay a nonprofit service provider or anyone basically to improve the situation of that client, as they often call them. Make sure they spend less days in hospitals, make sure they spend less days in jail, make sure they spend less days in the street. And if you can do that, the state rewards you to do that. There aren't many of those contracts out there now, but they can and should be expanded. And one of the things that we think will be most likely to fund that is these treatment models. The housing first model, despite some claims from the advocates, has shown very bad results in terms of getting people off of substance abuse with more mental health care and so on. The models that have really shown results are mandatory residential treatment models, where you keep someone either outpatient or inpatient for 6 months or for 1 year. You make sure they get off their addiction, you follow them very closely, or you make sure they take their meds, then you make sure they stabilize and move on with their lives. Those models seem to have a lot more heft in them. Places like Birmingham, the Doe Fund in New York City, these models seem to get people to the next step. And so if we can reorient funding to those sort of treatment heavy models and pay for performance, we can get a lot more people, those chronically homeless person on the street. And if we get more of that short-term shelter, we can help those people who just need a hand up and a short economic lifeline and all the rest of it, instead of cutting that back. So and of course, we are also, go on.
No, go ahead.
Well, of course, the other thing, we are advocates of the camping bans, because like a lot of the mental health providers will tell you that that is often a first step to help the homeless get into those treatment programs and the rest of it. And I understand the heated feelings on each side of that, but on the net, it seems to be help the homeless a lot.
So then one more question on that is, do you have a sense of the amount of money that we currently spend per person, and in terms of the budget allocated by the city, is that enough to try to address the issue the way through the models that you're proposing here, or that would need extra appropriation from the city?
Well, it is enough if we redirect the models. So one of the biggest problem with the permanent supportive housing, or the housing first model, is that it's incredibly expensive. You often get numbers of anywhere from $200,000 to $500,000 to places like LA and San Francisco, $750,000 per unit. And so if you have a single homeless person occupying one of those homes, then you have something equivalent. If you think of the average American working, getting about $50,000 a year, you're going to take 15 of those people working full time to support one homeless person in one of those homes. That's not sustainable over the long run. One of the things, but if you do these cheaper versions, if you have the structured camping facilities, if you have the $30,000 per unit, you can do that. You can do that pretty good. The residential treatment for the long-term things, I think that's more typical. We've had about, unfortunately, about 50 years of defunding mental health, and into specifically defunding the mental health institutions. About in the 1950s, we had 550,000 people that were in a mental institution. Now we have about 50,000. Now, I'm not saying we should go back to the one flew over the cuckoo's nest days and kind of put people back in these institutions, but I think most people agree that at this point, there are too many people with mental illness, and we all know them, who don't have access to that treatment. That may require a little more funding, but and we could get that if we moved away from the contemporary housing first model, which is just, we've tried this on a national level too. We built 200,000 of these units, and it's done nothing to decrease unsheltered homelessness. And so if we can redirect that funding, there would certainly be enough.
So you seem kind of down on the housing first model, but do you see a role for, more reducing restrictions on private sector building? Because in Austin, if you wanted to build a whole bunch of new units, you're going to have all sorts of permitting. Like if somebody just wants to make money renting cheap units to people, there's a lot of impediments to that. Yeah. Do you think relaxing those, maybe requiring less, political capital to get building done, which I understand is really important here, would that be something that you guys would see as helpful, or is it going to?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we've seen, and people say, like, both for the short term, the economically disadvantaged, and for that chronic homeless population, is that bringing down market rents do seem to reduce homelessness. What you see in places like San Francisco, LA, and elsewhere, when you have restrictions on private sector building, you drive up rents everywhere. And frankly, you even drive up the cost of making that permanent supportive housing. So it hurts both ways. You can't even create the homelessness shelters and the other services you want, because the housing itself is so difficult for both nonprofit and for-profit buyers. The Council of Economic Advisors put out a report from the White House about 2 years ago, which showed that there was a pretty strong correlation between rents and homelessness that affected more of the short-term population than the long-term unsheltered, but it affected both. And so, getting more people involved in breaking down those barriers is going to be a big part of fighting homelessness. And one of the problems in California is definitely that they just haven't allowed any private sector market rate housing to go up, and that's hurting everybody.
All right, so let's see. If you want to make some concluding remarks, I want to move on here to ask some questions from the audience. There's a lot of interest in the audience. Richard, anything else? Any last question before we move on? Okay, so if you're in the audience, if you want, you can either type in the Q&A. If you want to raise your hand, I can invite you to speak as well. So please go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll start here by looking at the Q&A. So one of the questions that appears a couple of places in the Q&A here is a concern about the criminal justice implication associated with Prop B. So a lot of folks are concerned with that, and I think one of the emotional reactions that we're seeing is that, well, criminalizing the issue is not going to solve anything. So what's your take on that, and your assessment of the consequences in that direction?
Yeah, so I mean, it is a concern, and people are right to be concerned about it. One of the things we've seen in places where camping bans are in place, and I actually remind people that 90% of cities, according to recent city, have this. This is not an atypical thing. The atypical thing is actually to allow sort of blanket camping, and it's not it is a bipartisan thing. Denver and San Francisco, two of the bluest cities in America, voted very strongly. Denver by 85% for camping bans, and so this is the standard. The reverse of allowing sort of blanket street camping is the exception. But how are those cities with camping bans implement them? Now, what we've seen places like Colorado Springs and Denver is that overwhelming numbers of them involve the stick of sorts of you need that promise or that guarantee of there has to be some push into it. But what happens is that the response to once that places in there, you don't just handcuff a homeless person just for sleeping on the street. You usually refer them to shelter or services. And actually 93% of the contacts with police and requirements to move along before 2019 were carried out voluntarily. So the police didn't even need to refer someone to shelter or services. They just, can you move somewhere else to this? And most people said, well, yeah, of course, I'll move to X, Y, or Z, or the police would say, can I get you to the next spot? So the vast majority of what happens is not a sort of criminalization of it. You can also make, when you've seen places like Denver and Colorado and others, you make it basically a minor misdemeanor. And usually the sentence, such as it is a reference to treatment. So you don't have to make this. And what you've seen in all of these places is you don't have someone being thrown in jail, usually for sleeping on the streets. That almost never happens. It is worthwhile, and it seems to be in these places, to have that extra encouragement, because again, someone in a mental health crisis is not going to listen if you just say, can you please move along all the time? But if you can tell them, can you please move along? This is required. They generally do it, and they get to that next step. So, it is a legitimate concern. It can be done poorly. I'll admit that some cities have done it poorly, but Austin before 2019, like most cities, did it pretty well. They got people into treatment. They did move along orders, as they're called, and they did voluntary compliance.
The other question here is about the role of the private sector, charities in particular. One person, Brent here, talks about his experience building up essentially a nonprofit that would employ homeless folks and help them, providing housing and work and help them move along. And he was told me, in this comment here, he mentions that he was told that by the Austin community first that this would never work here because there's not a big desire for work. So what's the role of work? Or other experiences? I think you mentioned the Dole Fund in New York City. Don't they? Is a similar strategy, right? They do work in that. And is that a big component of the recovery process here? Is to really provide a first step in getting back into the workforce?
Yeah, I mean, it's always distinct to every person. But like the Dole Fund is one of the premier examples. They have a work first policy, which is that we're trying to do whatever we can to get you back into work. And their population is generally people who've been recently released from prison. So the people that have been released from prison, sometimes they have mental health disorders, and more often they have substance abuse disorders. But they can help them with the goal of saying, we're going to get you into a job within a year and 6 years. And once you start in the job, that will be the motivation for you to help clean up, take your medication, not take the bad medication, and so forth. So that's a very, very noble goal. But some of the people, some of the unsheltered, it's tougher to even get to that first step. And that's the ones where you need just like the mandatory treatment, or you need someone that's surrounding community that's going to help them. So I mentioned Community First, a nonprofit that accepts no government funding that's southwest of Austin. If any of you have a chance to volunteer there or help, I recommend it. They require people there to pay rent, to work, support the institution. And they've seen incredible drops in drug use and increases in sobriety and so forth. And so, those models can work. And there's a lot of great private sector work going out there. One of the things you'll hear, though, and I should mention this, is that the housing first model has been so pervasive that a lot of nonprofits are reluctant to speak up against this. And they'll say this privately, because the housing first model is explicitly, and maybe I didn't emphasize this enough, is a no required treatment model. So I talked to a nonprofit provider in in Arizona, who said, I'm constantly in trouble with the government because in my residential treatment center, I try to get people off drugs. And the government will tell me year in, year out, stop doing that. We're doing a housing first model, which means no requirements, which means you have to stop telling people to be off drugs. And her hands are tied because she receives government funding. And she's literally tearing her hair out, saying all my clients are desperate to do this, and I can't even get them to the next step. So that's why people like Alan Graham and elsewhere who are separated from the government have more authority and leniency to sort of do these innovative things. Because right now, the housing first model is telling a lot of people, do not give your people treatment. Offer it to them, but you can't mandate any of it. And that's been a real problem. But yeah, no, the nonprofit step is absolutely huge. And we've seen good places and people across the country take up that step and really help reduce it.
So you mentioned a nonprofit here in Austin. Which one was it? Somebody asked me you to repeat the name here, the one that you
suggested. Yes, I can happy to send the link. So the group is called Mobile Loaves and Fishes. They give food to homeless and help service to homeless across the Austin. But they have a place called Community First Village down. Actually, sorry, I said southwest. It's really a little east of Austin. And they take the very, very chronically homeless, the people generally 59 years old, I think is their average age. People have been on the street for 10, 20 years. And they give them a little home and then encourage them to work and get treatment, all the rest of it. And they've had pretty great results. And so that's one of those nonprofits that's really just doing an amazing job, sort of moving the needle on the homeless problem. Mobile Loaves and Fishes and Community First with an exclamation point.
All right. So another question here, it talks about the experience in Utah, the housing first experience in Utah. Do you know anything about that? And apparently they have been somewhat successful in Salt Lake City in particular. Any lessons from there?
Yeah, I mean, one of the Utah experiment was sort of touted by many about 5 years ago as the solution. This was the one that showed that housing first works. One of the surprising things, and I encourage people to do it, is just look at the Utah homelessness numbers. They have gone down no different really from the national level in the past 10 years. Some states like Georgia and Florida have seen 50% plus decreases in homelessness. Utah is not one of those outliers. Utah tends to have about the same level of homelessness as the rest of the country. And now some recent studies have showed, didn't take much studying, but they claimed that one particular homeless population, namely chronically homeless people, was basically reduced to zero. We now know that's untrue, and the unsheltered, it was depending on how they defined it, they changed the definition. And we found that the unsheltered population there has been remarkably stable over the past 15 years. So Utah, it once generated a lot of buzz, and now people have kind of had to pare back some of those hopes that was the example that was going to solve all homelessness, because we know right now it doesn't. At the same time, there's good nonprofits there and people have done a lot of good work, but it doesn't seem like by any measure they've solved homelessness. It's been about the same as the rest of the country.
So another question here that is more a little deeper and difficult, but a lot of the discussion today is to solve the problem of, okay, now we have the homeless here. They might be in the street, they might be camping or not, but what do we do with them now, right? But any understanding or knowledge about the problem of like trying to avoid people getting in the first place homeless? Are there any sort of like, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, well, sure, from the economic perspective, yes. I mean, I guess we think about ideas like a permanent basic income or something that could be, we have lots of ways in the safety net that can be improved in helping on that direction. But on the drug addiction and mental health side of things, is there anything that is preemptive, that's preventive of getting those people on the street that we could be doing better?
Yeah, so It's so often it is less one problem than two main problems. As you mentioned, you and Richard mentioned before, the getting more market rate housing out there makes it much harder for people to take that first step down into homelessness. If someone is short on rent for a little bit, because the rents in Austin are about twice the level of where they are in Houston and Dallas, they take that step into a shelter. It's easier to send down that rung and get into the rest of the trouble that does happen right there. So getting that more market rate housing is essential. Now, for the mental health thing, I think like the overwhelming problem is we need to get more what is called the assisted outpatient treatment, AOT. This is not like, again, the sort of previous one flew over the cuckoo's nest, nightmarish institutions. This is a court-ordered mandate for someone in a mental health crisis. And a lot of legal restrictions have made that very difficult to put someone in that. Another loved one who is dangerously mentally ill or violent, you will know how hard it is to get that person to receive mandated treatment. I have an aunt who dealt with this problem, and they were pleading with the courts, please put my son in treatment, please do this, and they just couldn't do it. So we need to open that up. We need to allow more of these people that are in crisis to get that assertive outpatient treatment. They can still be with their friends. They're not going in institution, all the rest of it. But they're going to get that step. One of those simple things is changing the law to prevent what's called psychological deterioration. Right now, you can often only put someone in this treatment if they're, quote, an imminent threat to themselves or others. That means they're literally often holding a knife over someone's head, which means it's really hard. But if you have this law that some places like Minnesota do, which says, well, no, if the court and the psychiatrist can clearly say, listen, your mental state is deteriorating, it's getting worse and worse, we can put you in treatment now to prevent you from going down that next step. And that's shown a lot of increased results. Substance use, it's hard. It's just one of the hardest things. Like, that's probably the hardest issue of all. And what we've seen is, a tripling in overdose deaths in America over the past 10, 15 years. And we have no easy solution to that. We know some residential treatment programs help people, but how to prevent them from getting to that first step, that's just really, really hard. And like, whatever we can do to, stop people from going down that addictive path, that's something we have to do. And clearly just allowing the overdose deaths to keep spiraling out of control as they have is not something that we can continue to allow.
All right, so to wrap up, we're getting close to 5 o'clock here. What happens next here in Texas and in Austin? I think we have a bill in the state that then the legislature going through that might instill a camping ban across the state. I'm not sure. I don't know the odds of that bill passing. You might have some insight on that. And we have an election here in Austin that might reinstate the camping ban on May 1st. So, and what do you think happens here in either the state or the city, and how this gets rolled out if this goes one way or the other?
Yeah, so I was at the Texas Capitol testifying for the bills. There's two bills actually going through the Texas legislature right now. It's tough to know if bills are passed, but there is clearly a lot of outrage at the current situation. What you saw is a lot of representatives in the Texas State House that were from other major cities really concerned about the Austin situation, because both Houston and San Antonio, who've done much better in homelessness, have camping bans. And you had representatives from these cities saying, Austin, what are you doing? So it wasn't just a Republican Democrat thing. You had a pretty broad-based support for kind of changing the policy in Austin right now. So it's a possibility that passed. Prop B here in Austin, it's tough to say for sure. I've seen actually some preliminary poll results, exit results seem to show that it's going ahead by pretty substantial margins. What we've seen in other states, again, even the bluest of cities, San Francisco, Denver, and so on, have passed these camping bans. So more likely than not, it will pass. The real issue is enforcement. Places like Denver passed it and the city enforced it. San Francisco, the voters overwhelmingly passed it and the city said, we're not doing anything. Unless, as we mentioned before, you're a powerful group or you're a homeowners association that has political pull, and then they enforce it in your neighborhood. So whatever happens, the real issue is going to be, like, one, how are we going to enforce it? Make sure we enforce it humanely if it does go in place. So we mentioned those things before. You're not handcuffing people, which is not the right way to do this. And two, make sure that it is actually in place, that people are actually enforcing these rules. One of the things I remind people, there is the camp directly behind my house. It's on parkland. According to even the current laws, that's illegal. They say you can't camp on parkland. but the city is not enforcing that part of the law either. So in the end, there's always a slip between the cup and the lip. There's a lot of trouble and even a law in the books, and what are people going to do about it? And I think the main issue is, at some point, do people get fed up enough with the situation that they have to take a different path? And that's what I think people are at right now.
Can the state play a role in enforcement? Because I don't trust the city to take a role in it. Clearly, they're showing that. But like, can the state take a role here?
It's tough. Like, it's the state probably doesn't want their, Department of Public Safety or whatever to be like walking the beat with the swinging the baton and actually getting people off. But could they? Absolutely. It's going to be tough. And at some point, there are other ways you can kind of pull the lever to encourage the city to enforce it. But it's really tough to know how to mandate something you don't. So that's why, even if the state passes something, it would be very important if the local city voters said, we want this enforced. Because in the end, I tell people there's I've seen no divergence on almost any other issue between the elected officials and the voters. The voters, again, in every place are pretty much unified on this. The elected officials are all over the map. And so if voters, though, can make their sort of voice heard on this, you're going to probably see more results in enforcement. And that's why kind of like, making a statement one way or the other is so important.
Richard, any final question?
Good.
Judge, thanks so much for your work on this super delicate, heartbreaking issue in a lot of ways. And also thanks for joining us. It's a pleasure to meet you and have you teach us a little bit about the issue.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure. And if anyone wants to reach out, I hope you can reach me through the Cicero webpage or anything else. Always happy to talk to people and help talking about this issue, because it is delicate and everyone, I think, involved means well. But I think people also understand what's happening right now in a lot of cities is just not sustainable, and people are looking at different paths. So I think it's about time everyone starts doing that. So thank you again so much for the time. And again, really appreciate everyone thoughtful questions.